Hi everyone, how are we doing? Okay, kind of tired, excited to be here. My name is Jamey. I only have 10 minutes, I'm going to dive in. I'm introducing our panel, Trans Feminine Histories at the Intersections. We're and are very inspired by Jules Gill Peterson, specifically her lecture, Queer Theory Killed Venus Extravaganza, in which she unveils the long-time structural foreclosure of the trans women, particularly the trans women of color, as a subject and as an author of knowledge. So to counter the conception of the trans woman or the trans feminine as what she calls an irreducible historical figure, our work aims to breathe life into trans feminine worlds of the past. And I'm going to dive into one of those right now. Typically, I'm a historian of histories of trans femininity and trans misogyny before the 20th century. I'm actually a historian of trans death and seeking to historicize the centuries-long colonial history of trans murder on these stolen lands. I'm not talking about murder today. Instead, I'm just going to briefly read from an oral history biography project I had the privilege to collaborate on with Elder Salish Wesley, who many of you may know from earlier in the conference. I've shared a link in the chat for anyone to pull up and read with me. There are also photos. I'm going to screen share so you could see some photos as well. But it's called Waking to Dream, The Life Stories of Salish Wesley, Transstalo Elder to Be. And I'm going to be reading part 4, which is about her early transition in Vancouver. It's called Diana Ross and Mariah Carey. While Salish's first spiritual moments of coming out would take place among university friends and select family members, she would soon embark on the bulk of her transition somewhere far beyond the constraints of her culture, school, and family. Vancouver nightlife. When the sun went down over the Salish Sea, a heightened version of Salish the Queen hit the streets. Dipping her toes in drag, ball culture, modeling, and finally dating, Salish was on the precipice of giving birth to a new form of herself. Except this time, she wasn't alone. 11 years her senior, and just ahead in her transition, Salish's soon-to-be best friend, Dominique, would pull Salish into a whole new world, teaching her how to move underground. They're photoed here on the right, very fabulously. Dominique was a gorgeous, poised woman with piercing brown eyes and a glowing aura of mystique and intrigue. She looked just like Diana Ross or Janet Jackson, Salish remembers. She was stunning, so I idolized her. From the second they crossed paths, Salish and Dominique were inseparable, going out on the town together 5 nights a week. Like clockwork, Salish would get a call from Dominique around 9 or 9:30 in the evening declaring either, "Girl, dress up," or "I feel like dancing." Each call came with its own dress code and expectations, the dynamic duo strutting like supermodels with feather boas and 4-inch stilettos, or wearing more reasonable, but still fabulous, outfits to dance in until the sun came up. She was Diana Ross, and I became Mariah Carey. Like most trans women in the 90s, Salish and Dominique's foray into womanhood was paved through the drag and club scene. Much like the fantasy world Salish would escape to as a child, drag balls, competitions, and categories where she was able to explore hyperfeminine makeup, dress, and comportment served as the doorway into another existence. Instead of dolling up her crystal Barbie, the canvas was finally herself. She was closer than ever to turning possibility into reality. The movie Burlesque was how we lived, Salish explained. It was just all glitz and glamour. Together, the two queens would enter drag contests for cash prizes, guaranteed to place in almost all of them. On nights out, they would hit up the Odyssey, the gay club of 90s Vancouver, attending themed nights like Shower Power on Thursdays, where naked men would dance around in falling water. Still relatively early in her transition, though, Salish remembers Dominique remarking on one Friday night, "Girl, when are you going to dress up?" While Salish had been dressing up at night, she had not yet committed to living her full, authentic self during the day. In response to Dominique's call, Salish recollects, "That Sunday night, I dressed up and just never got undressed." The 90s was the decade of Vogue, the supermodel, and RuPaul, who Salish remembers being the MAC Cosmetics icon of the time. It was all about the androgyny then, she explained to me. One day, while hanging out at the Lancome counter at the Bay where Dominique worked, the pair were approached by a modeling scout from Thierry Mugler, an haute couture French fashion house. Interested in the girl's look, the scout requested to stage a photo shoot and faux runway for them. I guess they saw this fabulousness between us, Salish reflects, and we were so happy. I remember we got dressed up like the red carpet or Diana Ross. You know how Diana Ross goes above and beyond? More is more. It was a warm summer's day in downtown Vancouver, which meant the sun was still shining when their photo shoot wrapped up around 8 p.m. All dressed up with nowhere to go, Dominique decided, as she usually did, that they would go to Earl's on Top, a posh second-floor restaurant down Robson, almost halfway to Denman. Strutting down the streets in full glam, the two supermodels owned downtown. Oh, cars were honking, men were walking into signs, like for real, and people were just taking pictures, Salish recalls. It was just such a time. When they got to the restaurant, the clientele seemed to stop all at once to witness their grand entrance. "We're here to eat," Dominique demanded, ignoring that they didn't have a reservation. "You two are too fabulous to be sitting with the common public," the flamboyant waiter began, escorting them to a hidden VIP room in the back. "Plus, you're causing a bit of a scene. You're looking hot and fierce, and we're going to treat you accordingly." This is Salish's recollection of the story. Among trans and drag communities, Salish and Dominique were in a total league of their own. But while there were definite moments of high praise and fabulosity, the day-to-day reality of living as a trans woman of color in the 90s inevitably punctuated the good times with painful ones. "The world did not concede to us whatsoever," Salish described. "The whole trans thing wasn't really a thing then." However, the exclusion Salish spoke most about was not from the general public. Rather, this vitriol came primarily from other trans women and drag queens. The drag queens were guys, and so they were of two minds. They looked down on us because we were trans, and there's a lot of misogyny in the gay community, amen. But they were also jealous because we could look like cis women, she explained. As two beautiful young trans women who could quote-unquote pass, Salish and Dominique were granted some freedom to move out in the world, but then animosity and jealousy among their community. We would get kind of pushed in the corner and marginalized, but we didn't care. Beyond her glamorous nightlife, Salish still had to keep up with her BA in education at UBC, something she remembers struggling to balance. It was between years 2 and 4 of university when Salish remembers the stress of her coming out, coinciding with unresolved childhood trauma, resulting in anorexia, severe insomnia, and suicidality. "That was, I think, the hardest time of my life," she told me. Behind her demure poise and intimidating gaze, Dominique was also predisposed to periods of deep depression, sometimes to the point where she would stop answering Salish's calls. Both living in Vancouver's West End, Salish and Dominique ensured they were always walking distance from the clubs and one another, making it easy for Salish to check in when her friend went unresponsive. "I was so persistent," she remembers. "I would just go right to her place and bang on the door until she answered." As her closest friend and sister, Salish was willing to do anything she could to foster Dominique's wellness. Over the years, this took the form of getting her apartments, making her go to the doctor or dentist, and even cooking her healthy meals or offering her protein shakes. In 2006, Salish would be the one and only maid of honor at Dominique's small wedding. Despite their inseparability for nearly a decade, Dominique would soon after disappear from Salish's life, no longer returning her calls and suddenly moving away without warning. "To this day, I will still call her my best friend," Salish reflects. "I miss her. I really miss her. I just hope and yearn that we'll come together again someday." Entering her late 20s, Salish would also soon leave the nightlife behind for a professional career in education. Aligning with Dominique, Salish would also meet her husband and begin to build a life with him, eventually moving back to Chilliwack on her family's reserve at Scoutkill in 2008. "All those years in the city, from 94 to 08, I never ever imagined leaving," Salish explained, "and I barely even came here to Chilliwack to visit because I wasn't anyone when I came here." While Salish forged her path to authenticity and wholeness as a young, fearless trans woman on the streets of Vancouver, the daunting challenge of translating that confidence and authenticity into her traditional style of life was still ahead of her. Without Dominique by her side, she would need to muster up the courage and push forward on her own. Thanks.
This paper is ongoing research for my PhD candidacy exam, and is focused on the history of sex change in Thailand. First of all, I would like to clarify the word sex change that I using here. I'm aware that it is probably outdated in English-speaking world, and it might be problematic at some point because in terms of medicine, it's merely focused on changing genital part, and the so-called sex change nowadays is known as gender reassignment surgery or gender affirming care, which encompasses not only genital surgery but also psychotherapy, hormonal therapy, and non-genital surgical procedure. But as a non-native English speaker, I would like to use this word sex change as a way to question the universality of transgender medical healthcare. And as a historian, I cannot find the Thai translation of the so-called gender reassignment surgery or gender affirming surgery care in Thai medical archive. One of the inspiration to work on this topic come from my identity as a Kachay or trans woman myself, and also my personal experience as having been through medical transition in Thailand. And more than that, another inspiration to discover the history of sex change in global context came from a Thai novel. This one. A Thai novel ทางสายที่ 3 written by Kirati Chana. Kirati Chana is the first Thai transsexual woman novelist. She moved to the US in the late 1960s and received a sex change surgery in 1975 with Dr. Stanley Biber. Her section operation took place at Mount San Rafael Hospital in Trinidad, a small town in Colorado, in the USA, and she wrote her section experience into her first semi-autobiographical novel book, ทางสายที่ 3, or the third pathway. And the first edition was published in 1982. At the time, Trinidad, Colorado, once was known as a section world capital. The pioneering surgeon Stanley Biber had done over 4,500 operations since he began doing the surgery in 1969. But nowadays, it is not necessary for people like Kirati Chana or like myself, a young generation trans woman, to travel to Europe or to North America to receive sex change surgery, because nowadays Thailand become one of the world's sex change capital. Ironically, most Thai people from around the world, specifically transgender women from around the world, travel to Thailand to get sex change surgery. And yeah, there is a study by Thai scholar which found that between 1985 to 1990, only 5% of transsexual patients operated in Thailand were foreigners, and the opposite, 90% of transsexual patients operated in Thailand in the period 2010 to 2012 were foreigners. And this study also point out that nowadays there are at least 2 or 3 foreigner patients operated per day in Thailand and receiving male to female sex reassignment surgery. This brings to my research question: before sex change surgery in Thailand become a big market, become a product or medical service for worldwide trans people, how sex surgical knowledge which was produced by the West had been transferred to Thailand, and how Thai doctor had conducted a study of changing sex, whom were studied and how. To answer this question, I has explored Thai medical archive and tried to write the historical development of sex change surgery in Thailand. This paper is based on a medical archive fieldwork from last summer. Last year, I returned back to Thailand and do archival research mainly at Faculty of Medicine Library at Chulalongkorn University. For my primary source, I discovered 14 medical papers related to transsexual and intersex medicine in Thailand between 1960 and 1980. Here, this is a historical development of sex change surgery in Thailand that I try to write from the source that I can access. In the late 1950s, the first case of intersex was found by a doctor in hospital in Chiang Mai. Rather, in 1962, this case had been reported in Thai medical paper. Between 1960 and 1970, there were 3 medical papers which report patients diagnosed as hermaphrodites. They also reported the medical procedure that they had done for them. In 1961, Dr. Sutsan Vishayan and Dr. Arun Park Suwan, I think he's like Harry Benjamin or Magnus Hirschfeld in the West, and he's a pioneer in this. They are the pioneer in this field. They started to explain Kathoi by the term transvestite, and in their research, they studied 18 Kathoi prisoners in Lat Yao prison in Bangkok, and most of them were arrested by prostitution. In 1972, there was a discussion meeting among Thai experts and representatives, including 2 doctors, 2 lawyers, and 1 well-known Buddhist monk, and also 1 Kathoi celebrity at that time. Her name is Pan Bunnak. They came into a meeting and discussed whether the doctor should provide section surgery for those who having a normal body, but having a desire to change their genital or not. In other words, they decide to whether they should do surgery for trans patient or not. And in that meeting, most of them were disagree to provide section to trans patient. But in 1973, Dr. Sutsan Vishayan wrote an article section in the USA. And then in 1975, Dr. Picha Teotanon and Dr. Prakop Thongpiu performed section surgery for trans people at Chulalongkorn Hospital. This in the same year that Kirati Chana had a section surgery with Dr. Stanley Bible. And then in 1983, sex reassignment surgery had been taught in Chulalongkorn University Hospital, and section surgery was lawful in Thailand. It was promulgated by the Medical Council of Thailand. To summarize, To summarize, today I want to make a conclusion, but honestly, this may not be a complete conclusion because I have 2 or 3 places in Thailand to visit for archival research in this coming summer. Anyhow, to sum up, I would like to end with some thought and assumption from what I learned from the medical archive in order to further develop. Firstly, Western sexology, specifically on hermaphroditism, transsexualism had been transplanted to Thai medicine since in the 1960s. And secondly, the sexual research and experiment in hermaphroditism and transsexualism had been conducted by Thai doctors between 1960 and 1980. They used various medical and scientific methods, including chromosomal, anatomical, psychological tests to study Kathoi and intersex people. Lastly, Thai doctor I want to argue that Thai doctor first performed section surgery in intersex people rather than in Kathoi or trans people. In other words, section surgery in Thailand had begun in intersex body, not in transgender body. Thank you.
Hello. So before beginning, I have to comment how rare it is to be on a panel entirely of other trans women. This is the first time for me. All right, down note. Due to trans misogyny and other structural barriers, there are few trans women or trans femmes in academy. To exist with other trans women scholars on its own is groovy enough. But to work with other trans women in support of trans academics is even groovier. There is a severe lack of trans scholarship and trans history done by trans people. But as Ms. Sandra said at the Two Spirit Elders panel, us trans people are creators and co-creators. My sister Jamey Jesperson and I are publishing a special issue on Two-Spirit and trans history by Two-Spirit and trans historians in the Graduate History Review, UVic's premier academic history journal. I have posters of the CFP with me.
And for those on Planet Zoom, it's also apparently in the Zoom chat. April 10th is the deadline. Yeah, do it. So, but I digress. So I'll be speaking on racialized stereotypes in trans feminine erotica. If you don't want to hear about racist, white supremacist stereotypes, I'm not going to say any slurs, but you know, the stereotypes, please feel free to leave the room. I'm not going to be offended. Thankfully, my talk's only 10 minutes, so you don't have to depart for long. So, we're on the stolen land of the Lekwungen, Songhe, Esquimalt, and Wasanich sovereign nations. Indigenous land dispossession enabled the site of the university, and the academy remains an institution fully enmeshed in white supremacist settler colonialism. So before speaking about historical racism and white supremacy in trans feminine erotica, I want to talk about how my work and presence here is supported by contemporary white supremacist settler colonialism, and also to, do a good old call-in. You'll have noticed in posters and emails for this conference for the Youth and Elder panel, and maybe other places, they have RBC's logo on them. The Royal Bank of Canada is the #1 fossil fuel funding bank in Canada, 5th globally. Since 2016, they have financed 236 billion Canadian dollars worth of coal, oil sands, tar sands, and natural gas projects. This includes within our province Coastal GasLink, which is being courageously opposed by Wet'suwet'en land defenders and allied land and water defenders. The RBC Finance Coastal GasLink is being brutally supported by the RCMP, the settler state's colonial shock troops, who continue to brutalize Indigenous folks in the name of pipelines. This Wednesday, the RCMP arrested 5 Wet'suwet'en land defenders at New Unistaden Camp. RBC is the 5th largest fossil fuel funding bank in the world. Only American banks beat it. And RBC is funding parts of the conference. It is doing so as part of what's called pink washing, rainbow washing, or corporate social responsibility. In 2020, RBC spent $140 million for amazing events like this, on pride parades, queer and trans film festivals, and community centers. RBC gives a small amount of their capital away to distract and mislead you. They think they can fool you. RBC funds, again, great community conferences like this, to appear progressive, but their actions materially support white supremacist settler colonialism and further us on the path to climate apocalypse. I would call in the chair to divest future moving trans history conferences from being objectified by RBC, to prevent marginalized folks from being pitted against other marginalized folks, and to stop all the people here from being turned into unwitting pawns to whitewash this settler colonial institution, to look good, to look progressive. Secondly, I've been at UVic using the great resources of the Trans Archive for almost 2 years now. I believe trans history is important to trans liberation, to build a better world. The topic of my talk is informed by many days of research of the Trans Archives over my time here. That is why I was so disheartened to see last summer the trans chair announcing a postdoc with Corrections Canada. I'm a prison abolitionist. I have friends who have been harmed by Corrections Canada. If we truly want to move towards liberation, to move trans history forward, it will not be done by supporting prisons. If we as an institution, as a community, are supportive of reconciliation, decolonization, and two-spirit resurgence, we cannot ignore that despite being 2.5% of the Canadian population, Indigenous women make up half of Canada's female prison population. This institution cannot be reformed. It should not be worked with, in my opinion. And if we wish to move trans history community forward and work towards Indigenous and two-spirit resurgence, it cannot be done by working with settler colonial institutions like the prison. Of course, I'm an implicated subject. I didn't pay to attend this conference. I, like others in this room, got a subsidy. These subsidies, my subsidy, were paid by RBC, the #1 fossil fuel bank in Canada. True change does not come from us as individuals feeling guilty. It comes from pushing our communities, pushing our community institutions to do better, to choose to do better. And that's also why I love and hate being a historian of trans communities. I see my friends and those I'm in community with reflected in the archives of trans feminine print communities. I study communities that chose to do better and some that did not. Even if I spent the full 10 minutes, I can't speak to the complexities and realities of racism in mid-century trans feminine print erotica. You can talk to me after. What I can say is that by the late 1960s, in the English-speaking world, an ecosystem of trans feminine porn had emerged, speaking to the desires of predominantly straight, white, middle-class, and male audiences. If you want the names of the periodicals, think of a trans-misogynistic slur and then add a bombastic objective in front of it. And you probably arrived at a title. For folks interested in more detailed analysis, I published an article on norms and contradictions of normativity in the above-mentioned graduate history review. It contains a full list of the 90 issues of porn from the mid-60s to mid-80s I looked at for that article and this talk. And while they were basically profit-driven erotic endeavors, there are two curious wrinkles here. First, these are absolutely community spaces, with a plurality of readers themselves being trans-feminine to a degree of permanency. We have letters to the editor, personal ads in the back, and oftentimes a few non-erotic essays, one could cynically say to dodge censorship laws. These were racist white supremacist spaces, like certainly, but these were also spaces of community, comfort, and sisterhood for some, and not just white people. A black trans woman writing into one such periodical notes that were not represented as often and not as gracefully through pictorial and or articles per FMI and similar publications. Trust me, honey, our consumer contribution is significant. She goes on to write, to my sisters of color, I send this special note. Write more letters, submit more photos, and by all means, girls, support FMI and all of Kim's publications. Girlfriends, Kim is our connection to the world, realizing all of us as one. So as the first part of the quote notes, very often black trans femmes were not tastefully represented in erotica. Well, interestingly, this was sometimes not the case. There were tasteful representations. Mostly we had lurid, exoticizing representations of black street-based sex workers with supposed quotes from the model speaking exoticized African-American vernacular English. I see commonalities in this trope of the sexualized street queen and the long-standing anti-black trope of the hypersexual Jezebel. But beyond these sometimes surprisingly tasteful depictions of black femmes, with few exceptions, indigenous, Pacific Islander, Asian and Latina trans women and femmes were all reduced to racist, exoticizing stereotypes. For the first two, playing on settler colonial notions of the exotic frontier and cultures. For Latina femmes, oftentimes racist stereotypes built on notions of forwardness or hot-bloodedness. Asian folks, we see the usual gamut of infantilization, submissiveness, and exoticization, but given the burgeoning role of sex tourism for trans feminine sex workers, we also see sexualized and exoticized narratives of street-based Singaporean sex workers of Buga Street. And then actually, it's interesting, later Bangkok becomes kind of the center for sexual tourism. Despite the trans feminine identity, really these racist stereotypes are hardly a revelation to those familiar with cis heteronormative erotica. So why does this matter? To turn to every trans woman's favorite topic, the politics of representation and visibility. Scholars Nicholas Matt and Whitney Strupp persuasively argue of the seminal importance, and I agree with them, trans feminine porn played on representing transness to the American mid-century public. This othering, exoticization, violent curatization of the represented racialized trans femmes shaped mainstream understandings of trans women of color. And more importantly, think about what that meant when we think about these periodicals as community spaces. For the few racialized women featured to be othered and objectified, surely contributed to subculture members' sense of marginality, which continues to play out today in overwhelmingly white trans spaces. Racist tropes within historical and contemporary erotica continue to impact the lived reality of trans women of color in the public sphere, doctor's office, workplaces, bathrooms, and bedrooms. Thank you, I'll end it there.
Hello, everyone. My name is Abigail, and I'm going to be discussing the commonalities among Black trans individuals from the first half of the 19th century, the whole way to the 80s, 90s ball culture. So before I begin, it's important to understand what the word trans in this context means, because obviously people in 1845 were not describing themselves as trans. They were not perceived as such. The way I'm using the word trans in this context refers to any sort of gender nonconformity that is different from from your assigned sex at birth. So like trans would be MTF, FTM, it's again 19th century. We do not see the granularity that we do today, but enough about that. Okay, so throughout history,
there have been many famous gender-bending figures and trans figures like Elagabalus, the Chevalier d'Elan, and James Berry. Yet, these well-known figures from the past are almost all white. However, that's exclusively perception. There were many non-white gender-bending figures in the past. Specifically, my main focus on this paper, Mary Jones, who was a black trans prostitute in New York. You have also an enslaved individual from Baltimore, Maryland, who was arrested by the police for cross-dressing, and also an enslaved boy from Barbados who was the focus of a trial involving him and his master and an affair. Most fascinating about these black gender-bending individuals is the ways in which their embraced gender and the dangers which they faced parallel the problems and freedoms involved in ball culture in the 1980s and 1990s in New York. And through their existence on the margins between freedom and incarceration and legality and criminality, Mary Jones and her contemporary black trans feminine individuals exhibit the common qualities which define black queerness, such as struggle and performance, even into modern times. So Mary Jones, who was also known as Peter Sawali or Beefsteak Pete, because this is didn't have moans or sexual reassignment surgery in the 1830s and 1840s, so she used a slab of beef as an artificial vagina. But Mary Jones came into the public consciousness because of a robbery in 1836 that she apparently committed. She was arrested for stealing $99 from Robert Haslam, who was a white man. The trial lasted only a few days, and while she denied she was the one responsible, she was found guilty and sent to prison. What is most significant about this case, besides its being evidence of a very early trans individual, is that she was allowed to wear female clothes to a trial. It could have been a form of public humiliation, but also the fact that she was even allowed to do it indicates that she was able to exert significant autonomy on how she presented herself to the world. And I had a presentation here, but I apparently lost it. But there was a picture of Mary Jones printed in a newspaper called the Man Monster, in which she is depicted in a way that's surprisingly bereft of.
Keep talking. I'll help
Oh,
you
sorry.
pull it up.
Yeah, that is. I submitted it to. Yeah, that is surprisingly bereft of the the transmisogynist stereotypes which you would see in media depictions of transgender women way later. It's honestly, for something from 1836, remarkably progressive. And she does not have the makeup or the other features, or excessive makeup or excessive depiction of masculinity, the features which are common to depictions of African American trans women in more modern times. But yeah, as you can see here, it's a remarkably sympathetic depiction, and it is something that we just don't see in modern depictions, even those that are trying to be more positive. And yeah, and if this depiction here is accurate, we have no reason to say it is accurate, but also no reason to say it is not, because again, we can't go back in time. There's questions about whether Haslam merely approached her as if he would have approached the cis prostitute, or if he knew she was trans feminine and was specifically interested in that. He would not have been able to openly admit to and wanting sex with a trans feminine individual because at this time in New York, sodomy was subject to 10 years imprisonment. However, still the fact that he was willing to go public and admit that he had any sort of relations with Jones is like surprising because it admits a lack of embarrassment over his situation. Like he was willing to admit that even if he was raw because not only the crime but also the racial politics of pre-Civil War New York City were extremely like as fraught. You had massive anti-black riots in 1834 and this was 2 years before the arrest, obviously. So you had these massive anti-black riots, which targeted both African Americans and abolitionists, but also interracial couples. And it is in this context that Jones was arrested. So Haslam's admission and Haslam's almost acceptance of that this relationship occurred is deeply surprising and would indicate that this relationship is actually one of the most unusual relationships in all of pre-Civil War North America, or pre-American Civil War North America. However, like her 1836 case, while the best known, was not the only time she ran into the law. In 1842, she was arrested for prostitution and faced significant police brutality. And she also had another arrest in 1846 with less violence, but also was for prostitution. And then finally in 1848, she was arrested again for robbery, this time for $122 by a man named Michael Bonney, who she supposedly tricked into having sex, which again, we cannot say that his is accurate based on the previous established social milieus that I have brought up before. But unlike all the other, unlike all the other cases, this one is most interesting because this one involved a direct relationship with a man named John Williams and John Linus. And what is fascinating about Williams stroke Linus is that he signed a prenup. He signed a prenup with Mary Jones, which is like crazy because it's like not only does it indicate that he was in a long-term relationship as a cis man in New York, but also he was willing to marry a trans woman back in 1836. Some men could learn about that now, but and most fascinating, this article is also where the previous mentioned Beefsteak Pete is from, where like she was arrested with like the slab of beef. However, this like after these arrests, there is a question of what happened to Jones, and there's an article in 1908 about a man named Beefsteak Pete who is said to have won an eating contest, but again, she would have been like 98, like in her late 80s at the time. So it's very possible that Beefsteak Pete just entered the popular milieu as a common term for anyone who had anything relating, any like ideas relating to beef whatsoever. And now we flip over to ball culture. If you're unaware of what, if you're unaware of what ball culture is, Jamey talked about it a little bit in the context of Vancouver, but ball culture is a predominantly African American and Latino LGBT subculture, which involves ostentatious and performative gender expression, like drag culture, drag balls, and just a whole bunch of fascinating and extremely fun gender. Messing with gender and sex and sexuality. And like, I use the movie, in this context, I use the movie Paris is Burning, which if you haven't seen it, you should see it, to connect the way in which Mary Jones was treated to the way in which the girls from Paris is Burning is treated. And it focuses specifically on Paris Bunny focus specifically on ball culture, and two people from Paris Bunny who I want to focus on, and then next couple minutes I have, are Brooke and Carmen Extravaganza. If you've seen the movie, they're the two girlies who are at the beach, I think it's an hour into the movie, and it's clear that they came from a background of struggle and poverty based on not only their presence of ball culture, but also their discussions. They talk about their long journey in obtaining a sexual reassignment surgery. And they also discuss the conceptions of queerness and womanhood and the desire to be seen as real. However, this desire to be seen as real also exists on the precarity between criminality and legality, because there was still, police still used an immense amount of brutality against these figures, against these women and these individuals in ball culture. And the precarity experienced by these people is very similar to that experienced by Mary Jones. They also face the violence from men, obviously with John Williams, stroke Linus, and also, I forget his name, but whatever. Sorry. But also in with Mary Jones, but also people like Venus Extravaganza, who was murdered by her boyfriend, and in an extremely grim way. And it's in this context of transgender minorities getting killed, the aggression in regards to men displayed by Jones, such as robbery, displayed by Jones, would have made sense, as it's a way, essentially, a defensive mechanism to protect herself by essentially making these men reliant on her money. And it is in this context, specifically the context of facing arrest, that we can see the connections between Black queer people of the present day and Mary Jones. And it is these specific cases, such as Carmen, Brooke, and Venus's relationships with men and their poverty, and then Mary Jones and the other non-white gender-bending figures we saw in the 19th century, that Black individuals of the 19th century and Black individuals of the 20th century share a concept of queerness. Thank you.
My name is Dallas Denny. I'm here to talk about the 50-year history of Transgender Week, which was known until last year as Fantasia Fair. I've been an activist for gender variant people since the 80s. It's been a wild ride. One thing I didn't expect was to become involved in an event that was founded in 1975 as a retreat for cross-dressers. So if parts of this presentation sound like a bit of an advertisement, it's not. It's merely a reflection of my enthusiasm for this event. I was immediately charmed by the town and the event. Trans Week has been called the mother of all transgender events because of its influence upon the community. I will explain that as I go along. In mid-20th century America, most trans people had difficulty finding their tribe. I can say this with some authority because I was one of the many who, despite attempts to find support of any sort, utterly failed. This is me in 1975, rocking my own hair. The photo was taken in an automated phone booth because I had no other options. There was no one available to take the picture. I knew no other trans people. People would get together in small communities. Mostly, the most organized among them were the cross-dresser communities. But for most people, with not many ways to get in touch. So events like Fantasia Fair and the retreats at Casa Susanna in Catskills in New York were quite important. In 1973, there was a trans conference called DREAM, which was held in a small lumber town on the Oregon coast. Members of Boston's Cherry Stone Club, some of whom had probably attended the initial Dream event, thought, hey, why not try something like that up here in New England? Two people provided startup money, and newly out Ariadne Kane was named the point person. In other words, Ari was to put it all together. Ari's primary pronouns are he, his. When he's cross-dresser, pronouns are she, her. Ari came out in 74 and immediately was put to work on the fair. This image is a scan from a photo in an album Ari gave me last year. The images from that book are now at the Digital Transgender Archive, and the album itself is at the Labadie Archive at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, where there's a large trans collection. Ari was the principal force behind the fair for a quarter of a century. He did many other things of note as well, such as working with the emerging field of sexology and educating the sexologists, holding symposia and publishing the Journal of Gender Studies. Perhaps most notably, Ari identified and still identifies as an androgyne. He was questioning the binary at a time when few others did. This is the photo book he gave me. This is a postcard of Cape Cod. If you look at the extreme left and just a little above and to the left of the leftmost top corner, there's Boston. Close to Boston is Provincetown. It's Cape Cod. And so they were like, where are you going to have it? Well, how about Cape Cod? Well, we're in Cape Cod. Want to do it in Orleans? Want to do it in Eastham? You want to do it in Dennisport? No, how about Provincetown on the very end? Provincetown has a population of 3,000. It was once a whaling center and remains a fishing village this day, but is best known for being since the 1800s a haven for arts, artists, and eccentrics of all sexual identities and gender presentations. Throughout the 20th century, LGBT people found it a welcoming and affirming city, and long before 1975, it was a gathering place. It seemed a perfect place. Streets in P-Town are and were then absolutely packed. Between Memorial Day and Labor Day, these are the crowds you get. I would call this a throng, a word I don't think I've ever had the chance before to use. And restaurants are packed, inns and B&Bs are sold out. But in spring and fall, it's just right. So, hey, why not have this new event in Provincetown in the fall, October maybe, when prices are low because the tourist season's over. Ari dutifully met his brief. He visited Provincetown and made arrangements with the Gifford House to feed and house attendees and host all the events. He was in touch with the various cross-dressing, then the term magazines and newsletters. Word went out, people signed up, locked and loaded, the event was ready to go. And then disaster struck. Less than 2 weeks before the start date, a Provincetown acquaintance phoned Ari and told him the Gifford House had been closed. Ari rushes to town, and sure enough, there's a padlock on the door. The bank is foreclosed. Now, remember, the entire event was limited to the Gifford House. Without it, there would be no accommodations, no meals, no venues. And also, consider this, in 1974, there was no internet. Communication between cross-dressers was mostly handled via mailbox services. So you would mail something to the mailbox service, and they would forward it. Most cross-dressers had not willing to be exposed at home, had rented mailboxes, and who knows how often they checked them. So there was really no way to get the word out. So he's panicking. And Staniford Sorrentino, one of the owners of the Crown and Anchor Inn, which is a couple of blocks away from the Gifford House, came to the rescue. He offered to provide all the services and at the same price. The fair was saved with the help of the staff at the Crown and local drag queens to provide entertainment and assist novice cross-dressers with makeup. The 10-day event went off without a hitch. The dates of this event, October 19th through 28th, 1975. Ever since, the fair has been held the week after Columbus Day / Indigenous Peoples Day, and the Crown has been a big part of the event of the city for the past 50 years. This is the old Crown. It burned to the ground in 1988 and was rebuilt in the same format in 99. So things are ready, but there's a hitch. There's always a hitch. It seems that Crown and Anchor co-owner Stan Sorrentino was a mobster. Ari told me this when I interviewed him, and I Googled Stan, and sure enough, he was. He fled. He was arrested for tax evasion and fled and evaded the authorities for 6 years before he ran out of money and surrendered himself. So fortunately, his criminality was not then known, and he was a wonderful and gracious host for the Fantasia Fair for the first years. Now, there's a story about the first fair. He did his best to get the word out, but a registrant from Seattle, afraid of flying cross-country cross-dressed, or even carrying a feminine clothing in a suitcase, and afraid of even riding a bus or train long distance, took a bus across Canada from Seattle all the way to Provincetown, gets to the door of the Gifford House and finds it locked. The fair was ongoing only 300 yards away. She gets back on the bus and goes all the way back across the US and Canada to Seattle. And when I think of how frightened she must have been, how anxious she must have been at the thought of being with people who would accept and understand her, and how angry she must have been, it just makes me cry. Ari told me he sent a refund, but she wasn't mollified. Here's a photo of Sandy Messick from the first fair. Sandy attended as a reporter for the Philadelphia-based sexually explicit female impersonator news. That's Sandy in the middle, and that appears to be Ari on the right. I don't know who that is on the left. Ari and Sandy might be the only two attendees of the first fair who are still alive. Here's some of the coverage from Sandy. There's been a lot of publicity about the fair over the years, mostly positive. The biggest thing that happened was the publication in the November 1980 issue of Playboy magazine featured an article by D. Keith Mano. And I read that, and I was free, and I wanted to go. And Mano stressed how expensive the event was and how exclusive it was, which it wasn't really. And I didn't go, but Vanessa Edwards Foster did, and she had no money. She just had enough money for gas, as did I. She went and I didn't, and she ended up being photoed by Mariette Pathy Allen, and it is in Mariette's book, Transformation. Vanessa's been an activist ever since. The early fairs were promoted as an event for cross-dressers, but by the time Mano arrived in 1980, it was clear all sorts of gender-variant people were present and welcome. This was in contrast to the transphobic and homophobic attitudes of most cross-dressing groups of the time. This is Emily Sheldon's photo of registration at the 1976 Fantasia Fair. I'm sorry, 86 Fantasia Fair. The woman with the black purse at far right is Betty Ann Lynn, who with Ari ran the fair for some years. Other directors over the year have included, in order, Marissa Cheryl Lynn, Allison and Dottie Lang, me, Mickey Alicia Gilbert, me again, and Dee Laval. Programming at early fairs was mostly about comportment and presentation. There were lots of workshops on makeup, wig styling, and clothing. This photo by Mariette Pathy Allen shows a pajama party at one of the fair's B&Bs. In the early days, housing was included with registration, which is why Mano thought it was so expensive. And there were official houses. For 10 days every year, they were not entirely unlike the houses of the ball culture. When it came to the fair's various awards, the houses were fiercely competitive in bringing forth and shamelessly promoting candidates. In 1992, I received a phone call from the late Allison Lang, inviting me to join the board of the Outreach Institute, the 501c3 nonprofit Ari had started. And I accepted. I understood the fair was in some trouble, and I went. So there were still a few vestiges of Virginia Prince's no transsexuals, no gays caste system, but they were subtle, and I immediately set out to eradicate them. And my involvement is, I've been involved in a leadership position as the fair since 1992. So That's another story for another time. This is a picture of me and Allison in 1996 at the fair. By the mid-90s, the fair had changed in significant ways. It was officially an open event. While there were still workshops, we were now talking about history and politics and activism and all kinds of things. Here's a photo. There's Jude Patton, who's at this conference, third from the left, who receiving an award last year. So the fair has moved steadily towards acceptance, initially towards transsexuals, then towards transmasculine people, and most recently towards non-binary people. The fair is not there yet. It's an elderly demographic, and but the leaders are envisioning an evolution in which anyone who can get themselves to Provincetown can find support in family. And that's why we changed the name last year to Transgender Week. Whatever the future might unfold, the fair will continue, Transgender Week, as I'm now going to call it, will continue to do the things it does best. Hundreds of marriages have been saved. Hundreds of lives have been saved over these 50 years. And I'm not going to go into this because I'm running out of time, but the people who came to the Transgender Week have been legion, many of whom became leaders in the community after initially coming to Transgender Week. And many organizations were born by these people, some of them during Transgender Week, at the very week. Here's an example. Marissa Cheryl Lynn, then newly out, was a staff member. She went on to launch Tiffany Club of New England, and that was just her getting started. This is Winslow Street, where the Winslow Street Fund and IFGE were hatched. Why do I go? I went initially because I was invited to join the board and because I was curious because of that article in Playboy, because I'd heard rumors that the event had become unorganized and needed help. Why am I still attending 30 years later? Because it's important, because of the effect it has on people, because of its ability to make change.
Dallas, I need to cut you off soon. I'm sorry.
Okay, I got 30 more seconds. Second is the Sea Friends, and then there's Provincetown, which is weird and beautiful. And the first place the Pilgrims landed. So, thank you.